Let's discuss some of the key terms that scholars like to use when they talk about Hebrew poetry. And as we do so, I'll also mention the ones that I like to use for our guide to keep things a little bit simple and direct. At this point, we've talked about three main types of parallelism, and these are synthetic, which is where there's a development of ideas, synonymous, which is where the same idea is expressed in different terms, and antithetic, which is a contrast of ideas. These three terms are useful, but they're also somewhat basic, and we're definitely going to develop these ideas in more detail. Now, if we want to talk about a specific line of poetry, so let's take line 1 here, and we want to talk about one line, then what do we call that? Well, scholars have come up with different terms. You could simply call it a line, of course. You can also call it a stick, which sounds a bit funny maybe, a stick with a CH. Some scholars like the term colon, not the punctuation mark. And finally, occasionally you'll see the term verset, which I don't really love that much, but it is one that is out there. For our purposes, we'll mostly stick with line, but it's good to be aware of the other ones. Then, if we want to talk about two lines that form a parallel unit, so two lines, okay, so two lines specifically, which could of course be synonymous or synthetic or antithetic, then we can use different terms for this too. And one of these terms is simply a pair of lines, a pair. We can also call it a couplet. That sounds a bit old-fashioned and might remind you more of Shakespeare, which is not super helpful here. We can call it a bicolon. So bi refers to two, and we've seen colon before. And finally, we can call it a distich. A distich. Again, di or di has to do with two. I think pair is a good phrase here, or sorry, a good word, but occasionally you might want to use something else, especially if you want to sound a little bit fancy. Then we have three lines that work together. And a good example would be in the first verse where we have who does not walk or stand or sit. Those are three ideas that are clearly parallel. Now, most scholars pick one of the following two options. Some like the term tristic. Okay, tristic. Maybe that sounds like a cracker to you. I don't know. Or tricolon. Tricolon. And I quite like the last one. I think it's the best of the two, so I think we'll stick with that one. Next, it's useful to have a term for a set of lines. So a bunch of lines that work together. Imagine that you have two pairs, for instance, in a row. What are you going to call these things? Of course, one of the terms we could use is simply set itself. Okay, so we can call this a set. We can call it a bunch of lines. We can call it a bunch of sticks. We can also call it cola, which is the plural of colon. And all of these options are possible. I like the term set myself, or just lines. Again, keeping it simple is often the best approach, especially when we're just learning some of this material. As you can see, we're starting to get to bigger and bigger units of poetry. Another term here that's useful for that is the term strophy. Okay, so strophy. In Hebrew poetry, this tends to refer to roughly 2 to 3 verses that work together as a unit. And you can see that the editors here of the New International Version, which we're using, have decided that verses 4 and 5 belong together. They should be set apart. In fact, when you read more about Psalm 1, you see that there's a lot of differences of opinion as to how these verses should be separated. A similar term to strophe is stanza. And stanza tends to be used as a bigger term than strophe. So a stanza might have multiple strophes in it. It might be, let's say, 6, 8, 10 verses that form one unit, right? Now, in our guide, we're not going to talk a ton about strophes, so I've mostly just used the term stanza also to refer to smaller units that we might call a strophe, but I've tried to keep it a little bit simple here. If you do want to read more about this, there's a lot of scholarship on strophes, and if we can accurately figure out how big they are and how each chapter should be divided. The last thing we'll talk about briefly is another way to think about parallelism. We've talked about synthetic, synonymous, and antithetic parallelism, but we can also talk about semantic parallelism. So that's the first type, semantic, grammatical, and finally morphological. Quite the mouthful there, morphological. Well, what are these? So the most common one is semantic, and semantics is the study of meaning. If we go back, for instance, to verse 1, you can see that we have these ideas, right? Walking and standing and sitting, three different things that have roughly the same meaning. They have to do with motion. So we can see that their meaning is parallel. And that's really the type of parallelism that we're going to focus on the most in our study because it's the easiest one to recognize and it translates across languages. You don't have to know the original Hebrew to be able to spot, in most cases, semantic parallelism. Grammatic parallelism is pretty neat, but it's harder to spot. So imagine that you have two lines in a row and they both have the same syntax, which is the word order. Let's say they both start with a subject followed by a verb. Well, then we can say that the syntax is the same, right? Similar syntax. There's a parallel there, and we can call this grammatical parallelism. And then finally, morphological parallelism has to do with the formation of words. If we have, for instance, a singular noun, like warrior in one line, and then in the next line we have a plural noun, okay, which could be again warrior, but now with an S, or it could be army, right? Then we can see, hey, there's a similarity there, but there's a shift in terms of moving from the singular to the plural. And we can do that with all kinds of words. And when we're looking at the way the word specifically is constructed, we refer to this as morphological parallelism. That's fairly advanced. I would consider that mostly bonus material, but it's good to be aware of. And then the last thing we should probably clarify is how these three types relate to synthetic, synonymous, and antithetic. Think of this as really just another set of terminology to describe the same thing or to talk about the same passage. So these terms, they don't replace what we had before, but they tend to overlap a lot. For example, semantic, right, where the meaning is parallel, can be any of these. It can be synthetic, it can be synonymous, it can be antithetic, because we can have a development of meaning, we can have the same meaning, and we can have a contrast of meaning. That's maybe the way to think about this. You know, like if you're looking at a car, for instance, you can talk about it in different ways. You can talk about the color and have terms for that. You can talk about the way the engine works and have terms for that. Sometimes these terms overlap, and it gets a little bit confusing, but I think you can see how the terms relate to each other. Hopefully that helps you make some sense of the most common terms that scholars tend to use, and this gives us a kind of toolbox, a kind of terminology that we can use to apply to specific poems in the Bible.